end of the road for Futures 101, first round at least. This is lecture 8 that I'm launching into. It's been a real blast doing the lectures and all the reflective stuff, the interviews. They just keep on giving. It's really wonderful. And you guys, especially those of you who are showing up to the tutorials and everything, you're just a wonderful bunch. So thank you very much. So I'm going to go into a lecture that basically is a wrap-up for what we've been doing so far. So onwards and upwards, as they say. So essentially I've been developing a map for future studies with you. It's a map that you can on your own, largely, generate yourself. I've given you coordinates, but you have to give those coordinates meaning, okay? So the map could be a bit like the map of the subway, the metro for London or Paris or not Taiwan, Taiwan, I guess, Singapore, and so on. They all have these generative maps. Okay, so in the introductory course, Jeannie and I have worked at developing a map of the futures field. I want to thank Jeannie for providing 2 of the lectures, and it was really a useful insight for students also to see how we think differently but also in parallel. So you've got the lectures, you've had the interviews, bookshelf series, which will continue to grow once I get a breath. And of course you've got a selection of wonderful readings. What are you going to do with those things? Well, I would imagine you will keep dipping back into them, going back to things. That's the way I work, at least. I consolidate my thinking. Okay, so here we have one kind of map. This is the futures landscape as developed by Sahela Inayatullah. Okay, and it's used in the book that he and Ivana and I edited on alternative educational futures way back in 2008. It's a wonderful one. He starts off saying, okay, most people live in the jungle. People manage the jungle by being strategic. It's like the chess set. Then some people start climbing to the mountain tops and sort of leading people out of what you call slavery, like Moses did. And then some people provide a group, maybe, with a vision. We share visions. Okay, it's a beautiful map, and of course if you're savvy you'll go, oh look, it's like CLA upside down. You know, we've got the jungle as litany, the chess set as system, the mountain tops as worldview, and the star, that's the vision, that's the energy, that's your metaphor and your myth. So what have we got? We're navigating the day-to-day. We're planning in a stable world, but when the stable world's not so stable, planning gets much trickier. Some will experience the taste, the flavor, the identity of the lonely leader. That's the leader that's climbing to the mountaintop. And if you're anything like poor old Moses, he came down and all those useless Israelites were worshipping a golden cow again. And he threw the 10 Commandments down on the ground and they broke up and he stalked off in a huff. Okay, so you can be the lonely leader, but we can also share the vision, right? And of course, that's, for me, a really important aspect. That's futures pheromones, where people get infected, you might say, called to the optimism, the openness, the creative possibilities of rich cultural futures. So part of what I've been inviting you to do, and that's what the tribe lecture particularly was about, is finding your future story. I do not think there's any likelihood that you've really found it yet. Perhaps I'm even still looking for my true future story. I'm not too sure about that. But certainly this course is about preparing you to articulate to yourself a place to stand within the futures field. So the interviews illustrate, different futures and how they follow their truth, or perhaps what Timothy Morton calls in that little reading I was using last week, truthiness. I like that. There's truthiness. there. It's kind of truth, and yet it's flexible and maybe a bit loose around the edges or indistinct. The bookshelf discussions that I presented you with that should help you orient to the past as well as the present. Discussions that are grounding futures in an intellectual tradition that has emerged over many decades. Okay, it's not just something that's got sexy in the last 10 or 15 years. People have seriously been engaging in futures work and calling it so since the 1960s. In fact, the journal Futures was founded in 1967, for instance. Okay. Then we've got lectures. Of course, that's what I'm doing now. They provide some structure and introduce you to some of the broader aspects of futures culture. All right, so we've got all of those things. What am I interested in? Well, I'm interested really what's called futures pheromones. What I'm calling futures pheromones is those elements of the future that attract us, call us into a positive engagement with life in a broader and enabling timescape. So I've talked about landscapes. Now we've got temporal timescapes. Okay, timescapes are places of temporal flow where things are flowing together. None of us exists in an absolute present. We are surrounded by memories, and the images we carry in us generated by those memories and pressures or influences on the present, like movies and so on, provide us with images of the future. Okay, so, and I've called those ruins of the future, ruins of the past, and there are ruins in the present. So that's, where do you stand? Well, that's up to you to think it through, and I'll be asking you in the last tutorials, where do you think you sit now? What's happening for you now? So I'm going to summarize the course by moving through all the 7 lectures that precede this one, drawing on 2, 3, 4 slides from each lecture, saying these are some of the highlights. So this is a kind of potted history of Futures 101 as of 2025. So let's get started. So in lecture 1, these are my opening thoughts. These are from the second slide. Futures thinking for me allows us to explore futures we would wish for, okay, optimal futures. Okay, it's based on a set of powerful yet simple tools that enable us to explore physical, social, economic, cultural, spiritual, and mysterious shifts that are needed, okay, to occur for our more positive futures to emerge. It's playful. Futures should be playful. It should be joyous, and yet it's serious. You can play, and you can play seriously. I mean, you don't see chess players sitting around laughing and throwing the rook and the king and the queen at one another. No, it can be serious, but it's playful. There's some fun there. And that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in futures games and the gamification of futures and other aspects of the embodied future work that we can do. And of course, it's communal and co-creative. These are things that I think are really important. In that lecture, I also talked about the provocateur. The futurist asks questions that evoke. So then you become an evocateur. So from Ivana Milojevic and Sahela Nayatullah, they're all over this futures course, aren't they? It's wonderful. They've given us so much. So in terms of context, narrative foresight straddles the boundaries between the empirical, the interpretive, the critical, and action learning modes. So they are emphasizing the power of narrative. In fact, narrative really holds it all together. Myth metaphor is pointing straight at narrative, and it runs through like an electric current up through the 4 layers of the CLA, through worldview, through system, and up to creating sparks at the litany level. So we'll hear a bit more about narrative further on in this lecture. And then, we come to Jeannie mapping out the theories that underpin future studies: feminism, decolonizing futures, Afro-futures. And she gives us this great map, which is taken from McKinnon, okay, in 2020, trying to make sense of what is it that we do, what do different futurists get up to. This is another way of looking at the tribe. Where would you sit? Are you interested in theories for rigorous forecasting, or theories for effectively pursuing a desired futures of some kind, or theories for making sense of anticipatory processes or theories that represent effectively futures, or maybe radical, out there, absurd futures. Okay, these are all domains that us futurists will dance in. So Jeannie then moves on and says, look, well, this is one way of mapping it. We can use the double matrix. Okay, we've got the empirical, that's the real world, the cultural, that's the world of values and norms. We've got a critical dimension to futures. Good futures thinking should be critical. It should disturb power relations. It's very Foucauldian in that sense, from Michel Foucault. Critique is a way of looking at the world around us and being surprised at gender relationships, being surprised at the economic madness that governs and makes a certain kind of logic in a world where logic is captured by mad people. Or is it totally transformative, another area where the empirical, the cultural, and the critical get reframed? Goals is to question the future, Jeannie points out. Reality is process-based. Learning equals a program of knowledge and questioning and so on. I think it's a wonderful snapshot, and she takes that from Sahel and Ayatollah again. So where do we go? Back to me. Lecture 3. Some basic premises that I operate on. First of all, strategic foresight and future thinking are forms of social pedagogy. Look, I've been a teacher for 40 odd years, right? I see everything as having an educative dimension to it. And of course, one way that we can learn to be better societies, better cultures, better communities and individuals is to understand that the learning is social and that it's pedagogic. Pedagogy, therefore, the green one, is integrative in disposition and expansive in nature, i.e. it posits a center and an endless horizon. Anybody who has even an ounce of reflective capacity has areas where they are curious, where what the world offers them is always seen in the light of a learning opportunity. You wouldn't necessarily call it that, but there's this curiosity that bubbles through people's lives, and that's the sort of source of that. And of course, curiosity in my world links to those futures pheromones. We can smell them everywhere. They draw us out into the world of action. And of course, the other thing that sits behind those, both curiosity and pheromone, is that concept that I've presented you with of yearning, what draws us into the world. And pedagogy is the way we understand our relationship with everything. We are always learning. Pedagogy is a relational process, okay? It assumes a meta-human context, because relationships don't just exist within the human realm, they exist in the ecological or environmental realm as well. So, for me, in the futures context, this means we displace a single center with multiple centers. We need to rethink human possibility to actualize the relational possibilities. Okay, so human possibility, what can I do? What can we do? Okay, going back to Timothy Morton from last week, there's a species human and there's an individual, me and you. Okay, and there's this kind of interesting thread between the collective and the individual. What can happen in those spaces? What creative emergence might occur? So in this, in turn, this means, firstly, that we need methods to understand our pedagogical relationships, causal lab pedagogy, for instance. And secondly, and I'm leaving the secondly because I'm not going to talk about it, and secondly, we need to get optimistic. Optimism is cool. All right. So we need to be a positive vision of human potential. Yearning for the positive is what calls us into the world, right? And this, for me, is neo-humanism, looking at Rifkin's Homo empathicus, Bregman's Homo puppy, and Prabhat Ranjan Sarkar's neo-humanism. All of this is laid out for you in that book that I've made available to you in the course readings. I take a breath. That's the end of lecture 3. Let's move on to seeing what Jeannie had to tell us next. She was doing that potted history of futures, right? And she covered a lot of ground in that lecture. So what can we find here? Well, we've got an historical relationship with the future as a species now, as a collective, all communities. They've been interested in prediction, divination, oracles. Let's go and slaughter a duck or a chook and see what the entrails say. Astrology, looking up at the stars. There's a conjunction of Venus, or there was a solar eclipse. Oh no, we're in for it. Utopianism, another way of mapping the thing, is to write and imagine ideal futures where everything is in order and everything works perfectly and there's no suffering, okay? But we're as bored as hell, right? Scientific futures, futurology is what it was called, where people are looking, and that was the term used by I.F. Clarke, right, in his book, The Pattern of Expectation. And he wrote that book in the 70s. So futurology, we don't use that term anymore because it's trying to be something it's not. Biology, geology, yes, they make sense. But futurology, no, it doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. Why? Because the future can't be studied in the same way that rocks can, or organisms in biology and so on. All right. So from 1970s on, we have what's called modern futures studies. Okay. So Jeannie, drawing on Ivana Milojevic, gives us that one. And she then moves on to unpack it a bit more. She says, okay, how do we understand time? Futures is about the future. She points us at a few organisations like the Long Now and the Deep Time Network, TELUS Institute and so on. She offers us linear time first, then cyclical, spiral time, eternal time, relational time, non-linear, fractal, deep, and socially constructed temporalities. She doesn't hang around with those. She just offers them to us, gives them a bit of a spiel, and then moves on. And she talks about, well, what other kinds of futures are there? Well, there's pop futures, that's sensationalist and topical. There's social cause, that's strategic and issue-driven. It's critical, that's analyzes and relativizes the experiences of people. Okay, and there's post-normal, synthetic and evolutionary. What does time look like through these lenses? For the pop futures, time is short. Social cause is driven by the medium. Critical futures is thinking long-term. Post-normal futures is epochal. That means deep time. So the purpose, actually, probably the other purpose is to sell books. The purpose for social causes and futures is to plan, to be ready for. Critical futures wants us to engage, to become more active as citizens in a world where, if you don't get engaged, you get run over. And of course, the post-normal is to transform. I think that's fantastic. That's from Richard Slaughter's work from 1999. Take another breath. I'm jumping to my lecture number 5. Thank you very much, Jeannie. So I'd say, look, easy focus. Easy focus for me is when we stop looking at things with an absolute analytical eye and allow things to blur, like this image. This is where you use what I call shamanic futures concepts, like geophilosophy, the rhizome, intercivilizational dialogue, heterotopia, immanence and hybridity. I offer those 6. It was my response to Sahel's in Ayatollah's 6 pillars. I was in the middle of writing my PhD when he published that particular paper, and a terrific paper. I love the 6 pillars paper. And I was feeling a bit cheeky one afternoon. I thought, well, what are 6 shamanic pillars for future studies? And these were my offering based on my readings of Deleuze and good old Foucault and so on, and the other sort of post-structural thinkers. So I'm just chucking that in there because I think it's always good to have a bit of fun with your thinking. How can I reframe this? An interesting thing about that paper is I keep going back to it, I keep using it, and so do others. So it's heartening to see that. Then what did I do? Well, I turned to looking at the work of Elise Boulding and her 200-year present. And as many of you did a lovely version of your own 200-year presents. And this was where I recognized that, this image, which comes from Richard Slaughter's and my book, Futures Thinking for Social Foresight, actually is problematic. Because even though, this is not inaccurate, my grandparents' parents' self children and grandchildren, it leaves out all the other influences, all the people that have influenced us over time. So Elise Boulding, trying to think, she was born, I think, around 1915, and she died, I think, in the first decade of the 21st century. I've never met her, which was a real shame. But, you know, she was inspiring me from as soon as I sort of entered the futures field. She's a person who sits at that grandparent level, okay? And she sits there because she's influenced me. She's impacted me. So anybody out here that's influenced you, and that was sort of living a century ago, can fit into this diagram. So I just wanted to reiterate that here, okay? And then jump to some fun, creating and being creative with a CLA. So I asked people to look at a movie and do a CLA on it, and you came up with some really great stuff. My take on the Avatar movie was fun too. Yeah, but what are we doing all this for? Take a deep breath. Think about it. Why are we covering all this ground? Well, really the acid test, if we're going to make a better world, we've got to work with people. We've got to work with individuals and collectives, organisations and communities, at whatever level we feel comfortable with. Some people, like Sahel and Ayatollah, happy to talk to the entire United Nations and so on. Other people like me, I'm happy in a classroom in a small group, but, you know, I'm not cut out for talking to the United Nations. I don't have the gravitas, you might say, to do so. So no matter what level of engagement, top level government or corporations or grassroots community groups, foresight requires us to work together. And that brings us to this next slide. The slide from David Graeber from lecture 6, where he says all human beings are projects of mutual creation. Okay, most of the work we do is on each other. This is the futures tribe. Where do we find our futures tribe? Okay, so there's the wolf, which understands the tribe, and also who speaks for wolf down here. This is an ecological futures reference here. Who do we speak for? As Helen asked us in one of our classes, who gives me the right to speak for a curlew or any non-me being? Who do we speak for? There's an advocacy dimension, a strong advocacy dimension to futures work. What is reality? A cage that imprisons or a cage that sustains? That's riffing off reality. What is it? Is it a cage that imprisons or sustains? Sometimes, as Gaston Bachelard points out, limits protect. Okay? To whom are we accountable when we're doing our futures work? Is it future generations maybe? What of them, you know? What of the past? Am I accountable to the past? Will the ghosts of my ancestors come and get me for being irresponsible and unaccountable? No, I think we can actually say, if we think about the past in a creative way of and with folded time, we are accountable to the past. So then, and of course to the future. So whom am I indebted to? And of course, who speaks for wolf? When we stand up and do our futures work, there's always an elephant or two in the room. Jeannie kept saying, well, who's in the room and who's not in the room? It's that kind of question. We have to think for beyond the species-centric, beyond the planetary-centric even, to somehow start stretching the possibilities of our own imagination and our own identities. So, where's our reality? This is similar to the one that Jeannie used above. There is the world of things, there's the social, there's the cultural, and the personal. Okay, now this is using the 4-quadrant model as developed by Ken Wilber and adapted by Richard Slaughter to futures work. The next slide speaks more thoroughly or effectively to that. When we map our future, you know, we've got different tools. So the world out there, the world of things, we can use the Delphi model, visioning, training, and vision scanning, environmental scanning, sorry. Or in the social, we can use scenarios and so on. In the cultural, we can use critical future studies, causal layered analysis of one kind or another, and so on. Interior, this is us going inwards, reflecting on my story, my personal CLA. What is it that is moving us? How deep are we prepared to go in engaging with our own psyches? It's really interesting. And of course, as the second image illustrates, these are all folded together. They fold in and through one another. So, good. This one and the next slide created a lot of conversation in our tutorials. Where do we sit? Am I a management science person or a systems person? Or maybe I can combine systems with some speculative writing and networking. These are not mutually exclusive categories. It is very likely, however, that your comfort zone will be somewhere in here, and that from there you will work to integrate other elements. So let's say you're a teacher and you are interested in doing futures education. It's a very important area. Teach the Future with Peter Bishop and so on. Really powerful tools for liberating people. Teaching futures is also what we're doing in this course, of course, but I spoke to Adam Sharp in an interview, and he does a lot of teaching of futures with people through UNESCO. So it doesn't have to be in schools, but if that's your comfort area, then you might teach the future and you might get people to do some creative writing. Can you guys go and write a letter to the future? Aha, you've been asked that already. Networking. That comes easy. If you're in the classroom, you're already good with people. Networking is something that we do well. My interviews, all of them are a tribute to the fact that I have wonderful colleagues who want to talk to me. They want to talk to me because I network. Working upwards. What about scenario writing? That's another form of speculative writing. What about systems analysis? How about systems? Well, maybe. And I've got a friend in Sweden who studied biology, did her whole degree as a biologist, ecologist. She feels very comfortable here, but she can move straight down through these layers to education. And she skips over speculative writing, but she's a good storyteller. She doesn't write, but she helps people generate their own stories. And she's interested in this transpersonal dimension, having worked a lot with Nora Bateson, who is the proponent of what's called warm data. Where do you sit? Good question. Then to unpack it a little bit more, I use this image, okay? So we've got a layered approach for core elements of futures. Futures language, concepts and metaphors are at work all the time. We have theories, you've touched on some of those. My bookshelf stuff and all the readings, that's literature. There are organisations and networks. I just mentioned UNICEF, okay. There's UNESCO with their futures literacies programs. But there are universities like the one that I'm teaching at. There are also the World Futures Study Federation, the APFN, which is the Association of Professional Future, the Asia Pacific Futures Network. The APF is the Association of Professional Futures. There are many aspects going on here. There are methods and tools. So methods and tools, CLA, Futures Triangle, so on. And there are social movements too, where futurists, some of us get very engaged in making a difference in the world around us. Local, greening, commonsing, regenerating land, and so on. What else can we do? Oh, we can have some fun. We can play games like I was talking about. In the, lecture 7, I think it is, or it's still in lecture 6. I forget where I'm at the moment. It's lecture 6, I think. So yes, gaming, because this is still to do with finding our future tribe. Maybe your tribe is in a playful gaming kind of space. These are a few examples here. But, games are one way of helping people step out of their own skins, in a sense, their own constraints, and explore, play, have fun, laugh, and so on. So this brings in this slide here where futurist as a hacker. And these are two quotes from that paper I wrote on the futurist as a hacker. And you know, what do hackers do? The hacker is in the social or cultural milieu is the same as a program hacker in game development, for instance. All right? They see something and they will change it or shape it or twist it in ways that allow new possibilities. The first observation is that the futurist hacks narratives. Ta-da! Even citing that narrative paper. This hack sits at the heart of scenario work, which unpacks and recognizes sets of possibilities and so on. So I offer you the metaphor of the hacker, but it's also something that you can do. Live it daily. You can hack the concepts that you've been presented with as this is real. If we start looking at, let's say, what's happening in the United States at the moment and say accept it as real, then we are immediately stuck. There's nothing real about what's happening in the United States at one level. At the level of narrative, a major war is going on, and one group have taken control for a period of time of that narrative. And of course, at another level, it's having major direct effects on people's lives. So there's never an excuse to trivialize or distance yourself from human suffering. But it's a way of saying, don't get captured by a reality hack. You've got to hack the reality hacks that come at you, all right? Now, the last week's lecture was on evolutionary stuff. So that's where cosmopoesis comes in, the way that we work with the cosmos as a creative field to generate meaning and understanding, and also to come to somehow appreciate ourselves. There's a quote that I used to use a lot from Michio Kaku. It said, you know, in the universe we have a purpose as human beings, and that is to observe the universe so the universe can know itself. I think that's really important. So then we've got paradox, okay? So the world is becoming strange to itself. This is what I said at the beginning of my cosmopoesis chapter. You know, this strangeness is the result of two interrelated states. The first is surprise at becoming increasingly self-aware or self-conscious as human beings, right? And understanding that we are part of an evolutionary unfolding. That's serious stuff. The second surprise comes from the terror that this new consciousness evokes. Actually, it makes me incredibly responsible for everything. Every raindrop, every bug outside my window and so on. Now becomes part of my world story. I can't dismiss it. I can't dismiss suffering and so on. So we're terrified and overwhelmed by our responsibility, and we are also all inspired, gobsmacked, I love that term, by the fact that we are actually playing our part in the universe or the cosmos coming to know itself. And that's where the paradox sits. How do I extend that? Well, I take that into an evolutionary story. That gives us this slide here. Sorry. So, first of all, I posit that there are two stages of collective human experience in the early stages of our species. Most of our species in lifetimes, worlds, have existed in the collective. That's the emergent hominids from 6 million years ago, right up to about 10 to 12,000 years ago, okay, when we started to develop agriculture. But then we ended up with collective 2, which was a period in which we were part of agriculture, but we still didn't have much in the way of hierarchies, and the individual really didn't matter so much. It was more a community thing. As agriculture societies or civilizations became more complex, you ended up with the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, the Mesopotamians. You ended up with the Tang dynasties, Han dynasties, and so on in China. You end up with, you know, what are they called? The Maya, the Aztec, the Olmec in Central and South America. All over the world, wherever you get those kind of built complex societies, we have the emergence of a sense of our own individuality. I think the story of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia is a brilliant example of that. The story of Odysseus, particularly for the West, and the Greeks was a very good example of that emergent individual. And what happens here then is underneath that we've got civilizations 1, 2, and 3. Currently, we are at the transition line of civilization 1. Civilization 2. We cross from civilization 1 into civilization 2 at the Industrial Revolution. Okay? That Industrial Revolution heightened our sense of separateness from the world around us. That's individualism on steroids, ultimately. Okay? And it's a cause of a lot of interesting reflection from people like Friedrich Nietzsche I'm going blank for a moment. People like Hannah Arendt, Simone de Beauvoir, the existentialist, Sartre, that's the guy I was looking for, Jean-Paul Sartre. You know, these are people who really tackled the question of what does it mean to be an alienated individual. Marx talked about it in his Marxist social philosophy as well. This is the period of great alienation, a kind of terror in itself, a terror of vulnerability. And that vulnerability leaves us to do more and more civilization 2 things, building walls around us, houses, air conditioning, driving cars everywhere, driving fast cars, sending rockets to the moon, mining, forestering, growing, chopping down the entire Amazon so you can have McDonald's hamburgers, in the US or wherever. That sort of stuff, that's us dominating the world. Why? Because if we don't dominate it, it's going to get us. That's what happens when you get this hyper-individualism, you get a hyper-vulnerability, and you end up going a bit crazy, a bit like Hermann Hesse's Steppenwolf, and losing yourself in the quest to ease that sense of vulnerability, but never, ever succeeding. All right, so then we're on this blue line here, the industrial moving into the relational, okay, over here, heading towards the, I should do this so you can see what I'm pointing at, okay, over here, so you can see that. And this is where increasingly the universe is forcing us to pay attention. Our planet is saying, naughty, stop doing that. Global warming. The incredible shifts that we are facing that are based on our action, as Timothy Morton said last week, as a species. Our species is emitting so much carbon, chewing up so many resources that we are tipping the world into a climate crisis. Okay? What does that mean? Well, it means that all around us there is a resurgent interest in indigenous ways of thinking. But it's on the science side, that's where systems thinking and so on comes in. Ecological thinking talks beautifully with indigenous thinking. We've got a whole new generation of people. I'm just looking over here, over my shoulder at some of my books piled up there. Roman Krishnarik with his book on the good ancestor and so on, giving us tools for thinking and behaving relationally. Individuality is changing. Our sense of the individual in the next few generations of people is going to be more and more aware of and sensitive to a relational way of understanding the world. That will be civilization 3, where we still have technology. Much of what we do might still continue to be what we do, but we're going to do it in a different way. And I have no idea what that means. And there's some of the other things that come out of the talk from week 7 is that we have no idea what's happening really. And that was from Gene Houston back in 1977 when I was a lad. All right, so how am I mapping this? Well, my own futures approach is to use what I'm calling anticipatory aesthetics, which draws on the future's senses, okay? And I suggest that these are memory, foresight, voice, optimism, and yearning. I'm going to do a whole course for next semester, you could say, the second half of the year, around those. I think that they are worth unpacking for you because you can use them as tools just like you use CLA and other things from the Futures Toolbox. To me, though, it's being aware that we create sense through our physical senses when we're working out what's happening in the world around us. You know, I can smell fire, better move, or I'm burning the kitchen, I'm burning the dinner on the stove, or I have a sense that, you know, something is happening around me at the moment which I feel uncomfortable about. That is a psychological, cultural sense, and it will be informed by memory. I remember something like this happening before. What do I do with it now? I use foresight to anticipate and to move. Movement itself is voice. When I feel that I'm in control of memory and foresight and have some degree of agency, I become more optimistic. And what's pushing me along or dragging me along or calling me, if you want to be much more positive about it, that's that yearning, the calling into life, okay? These are the future senses. And the more I work with them, the more I enjoy them, I have to say. So then I ended up last week at the end of lecture 7 with 2 quotes from my book at the end. This co-evolutionary quote. So if the purpose of the universe is to generate reflexive consciousness, that's the universe coming to know itself through our own observation of it. Okay, the journey I have sketched here is one possible way to understand what's happening in the world today. It's an evolving, opening, and generative co-creational universe we are part of. And whether we like it or not, doesn't matter how hard people like Trump or Putin push back against this stuff, we are being forced, we are being dragged, one might say, to play with the cosmos and to own a greater chunk of our potential. And of course that brings in this sense of futures. Oops, what happened there? Futures pheromones, okay, where the pheromone is one of finding your tribe, connecting. It's also calling us to action. It's that smell of yearning. The past holds memory, okay, as I point out. We are wired for culture, yeah. There's always a choice, yep, to love or fear, hope or despair. As a data set of all that's been the past, the whole messy, squirmy lump of it is a challenge to take from. It's our best whilst recognizing violences and so on. We can't deny the past is filled with dark human activity. Life is creative, ever playful, and exploring possibility, okay? And the future is where we will find it always calling us. That's life and love, this creative stuff. Always inventing new forms and reconfiguring the old. It is the pheromone of possibility. I love that. It's such a delicious thing to say. And I love that language and culture with its myth and metaphor provide me with the possibility to play with sounds like that. Futures, pheromones, okay? And that's where we landed last week. So I just want to make one point. This is from a lovely little paper that I found in the Journal of Australian Humanities, okay? It's an online journal. The link is underneath this slide. Stephen Mukey, I've got his book over here somewhere. Ancient and Modern, that's what it's called. I can see it up there. And he said in that book that if we start thinking about reason and rationality, connection itself, relationship itself, is a way of reasoning, okay? The authors of this say that Mukey goes on to say, he provokes us to decenter, but not abandon Cartesian rationality. It's very useful, Cartesian rationality, but it's not the be-all and end-all. So he's decentering it so that we can move in favour of more inclusive sets of logics, plural. Futures, plural. Pasts, plural. Presents, plural. Now we've got logics, plural. Oh my God, you're saying, I wish markets would stop doing this sort of stuff. Well, it's not me. These guys are saying it. So connections are non-linear as well as linear, and representation thus requires non-linear forms. It may be that narrative is the method through which the reason of connectivity will find its most powerful voice. I've returned to narrative. Narrative is a relational form of being. Why? Because we tell narratives to ourselves, but we are always telling narratives to others, and we are always living collective narratives as well. And I think that's really important. So heading towards the very end here, a couple more slides only. So now it's time to gather up your thinking. I've given you a synopsis here. I came back to narrative, I came back to futures pheromones, and I came back to the futures senses, because to me, That's where my heart sits at the moment. And of course, I'm evolving. My thinking is evolving. It evolves every time I sit down and have a yarn with you, all on Zoom, or if we're having a coffee, if I'm lucky enough to have you living near me. All right, so what can we do? I would like you to do a few things. I'd like you to, after this lecture, sit down with a pen and paper, or maybe your laptop, and make a list of key insights that you've gained from this 8 weeks. Make that list, and I'd really like you to share it with us. Not just me, as I will put this up, for everybody to see our lists, okay? You might want to start making the list tonight, and then keep coming back to it every day, adding a few things, maybe deleting something. That's fine. I want you to make a list of things to be explored further. That's going to be very helpful for me as I move into another phase of this course for next semester. I want you to also start doing something practical. I want you to think, I'm going to make a futures workshop. Okay, some of you are already doing that, I know that, but many of you probably aren't. But think about it. You're going to start a futures workshop, you're going to run one somewhere. Might run it for free, or you might charge thousands of dollars. Doesn't really matter. What's the purpose of the workshop? Who do you think will attend? What's your market? How long will it go for? An hour, a day, a week? What methods are you going to use? What resources do you need? Cookies, coffee, that sort of stuff, pizza. But what? More seriously, how are you going to run it? Are you going to use post-it notes and pens and paper? Are you going to hire a narrative storyteller to come in and keep it tracked that way? They're fun, I tell you. So, and what outcomes are you looking for from that workshop? So that's important. So these are the things I'd like you to be working on, so that when we have our last session, which is, we've got 2 more Zoom sessions to go, it can be one of the next 2 Saturdays. It'll be the last Saturday that we'll be looking at that. All right, I'm forgetting because I'm actually recording this a bit earlier than I would normally. Then, my last question. All right. Think about my metaphor, futures pheromones. Can you describe this as a dimension of awareness? Can you put your finger on it, or is it just some weird thing Marcus has, conjured up? Can you leverage this concept to hack the given and release our better selves? Say that again. Think about my metaphor, futures pheromones. Can you describe this as a dimension of awareness? What do I mean by that? How do pheromones function? Can the future emit pheromones? Or am I using it as a cultural metaphor? Can you then leverage this concept to hack the given and release our better selves? Yeah, got to end up on something big, don't we? So that was a good one, a good big one to end. And now the last slide. I bid you a namaskar or a namaste, depending on what part of India you come from. Thank you for taking part in this course. I really do appreciate it. It's been wonderful, and there is more to come, so stay tuned. Keep me on your map. The bubble up is going to be left open indefinitely, so you can keep coming back to it and mining it as you need. I thank you from my heart to your heart. Yes, that's a wonderful way to end, isn't it? See ya.